The interesting challenge was the conversation we had 2020 and continued into 2021, which was visiting rights in aged care. It dawned on me because I actually went for a walk before it all got really nasty, and a 93-year-old was sitting there, and I said to him, "How are you going?" He said, "Yeah, really good." He goes, I don't like this." And he goes, "I've lived through these before." And I said, "Oh, yeah, no, we'll survive." He says, "Absolutely." And I said, "Oh, how do you feel about getting visitors?" And he was just brilliant. He just said, "Look, my 53-year-old son's just separated from his wife. I don't know who he hangs around with. Keep him out of here." he said, "I don't want him hanging around me." And I just thought, great answer.
Silver Adventures is a content and technology company dedicated to improving the lives of older adults through immersive virtual reality experiences. And this podcast is our opportunity to hear from industry experts, thought leaders, and passionate individuals to share with you their knowledge, expertise, and experiences. Welcome to the Aged Care Enrichment Podcast. Hello, welcome to the show. My name is Ashton Eve, and welcome to another panel episode. Panel episodes are our chance to bring together some of the foremost experts on a topic for a casual, free-flowing conversation. What we really want from these chats is to explore ideas from a few different angles, but also just to have a bit of fun. And today's episode is all about industry-wide cooperation. As you know, the aged care sector is an incredibly complex environment with lots of different players and very different priorities. And now more than ever, finding common ground and ways to work together is crucial. There's plenty of organisations around Australia and the world leading cooperation, from peak bodies and trade associations to global ageing networks, and we're thrilled to have a really diverse cross-section in today's episode. Joining us on the panel is Stephen Johnston from Ageing 2.0, George Margelis from the Aged Care Industry Information Technology Council, Mary Patetsos from the Federation of Ethnic Communities Councils of Australia and the provider Aged Care Housing, as well as Katie Smith-Sloan from the Global Ageing Network. If you've listened to the show before, you probably know about my background in music, and this episode is going to feature some music that I made in the middle break. Anyway, we hope you enjoy this panel episode on industry-wide cooperation. Why don't we jump straight into it? We'll do a quick around the room to intro ourselves. Why don't we start with Stephen Johnston?
Great. Hi, Ash. I guess Ageing 2.0 is the company. It's a global ecosystem for innovation. So great to be here. Just 2 seconds on Ageing 2.0. It's a organization that I founded with Katie Fike about 9 years ago now to bring together technology innovation on the one hand with aging, senior care, longevity issues on the other, and we've grown to about 130 volunteer-run chapters around the world, and we operate a corporate program called The Collective, which is working with corporates to help them address big missions and grand challenges facing society and helping improve the lives of older people.
Welcome to the show, Stephen. George Margelis, can you tell us a bit about yourself?
Yeah, hi, George Margelis. I chair the Aged Care Industry Information Technology Council, which is a mouthful. And that's basically the peak body for aged care technology. It's co-formed by AXA and LASA back in 2007 officially, but it's been in operation probably since around the year 2000 when the two peak bodies back then was sort of setting up the aged care IT roadshows. My background, I'm a medical practitioner by training. I've been working in healthcare now for 40 years. Last 25 years of that specifically in health technology. So started off in acute care, but as I got older, I started merging into aged care because it became more relevant to me. Key thing here is around how do we help the industry adopt technology in a reasonably successful way. I mean, we've seen technology adoption in acute care that's been successful, but they've gone meandering. Hopefully aged care won't have that same challenge, but big journey ahead.
Absolutely. Welcome, George. Mary Patetsos, welcome. Tell us a bit about yourself.
Hello all. My name is Mary Patetsos, and I am the chairperson of the Federation of Ethnic Communities Councils of Australia. So we're the peak body that represents people of culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. We work in all sorts of areas, health and aged care being some of our main focus. I'm also the chairperson of a large aged care provider, a large not-for-profit called Aged Care Housing. We are an innovative we think anyway, organisation within a very constrained and troubled sector at the moment. So that's what we do. I don't actually have one real job, so I also spend a lot of time in health. I sit on SA Health Board in South Australia and also on a university council. So I find the connections between all those things very interesting all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. A wide remit there. Welcome, Mary. And Katie Smith-Sloan, welcome. Can you tell us a bit about yourself?
Thank you, Ash. Well, I have the privilege of both leading a peak body and leading a network. So the peak body is based in the US. It's an association of not-for-profit providers of services for older adults of all kinds, everything from Meals on Wheels to hospice care and everything in between. We have about 5,500 member organizations across the states. But I also lead a network called the Global Aging Network, which is similarly a network of primarily providers, but it's tech companies, it's researchers, it's businesses that are all interested in making the world a better place to grow old. And our goal is really to share, to learn from each other, to innovate, to find solutions, and to advocate at the United Nations. So glad to be with you.
Yeah, fantastic. And thanks for jumping on the plane and doing the 2 weeks quarantine to join. Sorry, no, you're calling in from the States today.
Oh, please.
If only. An excellent place to start then is the idea of cooperation amongst the industry and amongst different parties. And I'd really like to, maybe Stephen, you can lead us off with this with your international network that you're leading. How do you unite an industry? How do you foster cooperation?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really important topic right now. And the pandemic has given us, I think, some fascinating and powerful reminders that international cooperation is possible if we're focused on solving a sufficiently clear and precise problem. And so I think my perspective on this is more about, let's start with the mission. Let's start with the problem that we're trying to solve. And I think this applies to all industry and frankly all society in terms of, the look at the raft of issues that are facing us, as we get up every day and bombarded by the news and personal and macro stories. We can't help but think, we've got challenges. And that is the way that I think about the world, which is, what are the big and interesting problems to solve? And I don't necessarily want to constrain the collaboration or the cooperation among any particular type of industry sector or player. But I think it's super important to then have the credibility and have the depth and have the industry buy-in with people who have the depth and the connections and the network. So I do think there's a healthy balance between trying to think about what problem we're all solving, but then actually also have real depth and real expertise in sector-specific organizations. So I think the key thing for me is mission-driven innovation, and I think it's about thinking it as a system where we work together, and it's an iterative process by understanding the complexity and the dynamic nature of the work that we're doing.
I would just add to that I think that with global aging, we're dealing with something that we have never experienced before in the world. And so there is no roadmap. We're building the roadmap as we go. And so we need to work together to do that, because none of us have a lock on the truth here, but we all have the ability to offer ideas and to innovate and to work together.
I think that's a really important point. And I think we're doing it in a context that involves multiple changes. So I said the other day somewhere, and I think I offended some people, but nevertheless, that's okay. I said, look, the idea that there's a mythical person, most likely the expectation being a woman at home, ready and willing to care and spend the second half of her life caring for parents, having spent the first half looking after children, is probably something we need to get over. So expecting that especially with ethnic communities, the sort of almost the misrepresentation that there's this huge family and a whole bunch of people hanging around with nothing better to do, except continue a care role, is an expectation that we need to get over. And in that light, how do we, how do older people age really well and have extraordinary lives? And what's available to us to do that? And in some ways, I see the pandemic dare I raise it first, as a really huge catalyst to push us along in terms of use of technology. We've seen that in health, and we're seeing it now in aged care and that connectivity. So I think this is a real opportunity for us to debunk some old stereotypes and also solve old problems, or wicked problems, or things that we have always needed to deal with cleverly right now in different ways.
Look, I agree with Mary there, and I think, but again, it's a bit of a pendulum in that we've gone from the personal carers doing all work to a lot of technology companies telling us technology will do the whole thing as well. So it really is somewhere in the middle is a solution, and I think that's one of the challenges we face in this area is that it's that classical: if you make hammers, everything looks like a nail. If you make technology, everything looks like a technology problem that needs to be solved. How do we combine the technology with the carers, with the social infrastructure? I mean, there's you're right, the pandemic's highlighted a whole bunch of social issues that, we've all been talking about social determinants of health for many, many years, but Sydney in the last couple of weeks has just highlighted the fact that when you put the whole city in lockdown, those of us in the eastern suburbs drink coffees and watch Netflix, and those of them in the western suburbs struggle to put food on their table. So there's a whole bunch of issues, and it is really complex. To Kate's point, I mean, my good friend Eric Dishman about 25 years ago was talking about the silver tsunami coming along, and everyone sort of went, we'll worry about that when we get there. Well, hey, we're there.
What are some, can we think of forums in which information that is crucial? Well, let's take the pandemic, the elephant in the room as we record this in 2021. Australia is suffering multiple lockdowns. How can we foster cooperation and shared information throughout the pandemic for best practices, for example?
I think that's an important point, and I guess Katie and I have a sort of definition around everything we do on a global basis.
Yeah.
I think the interplay between the local expertise, where we really need to understand from the front lines what's happening, what's working, and be interested in Mary's point about sort of the cultural and relevance of some of the interventions that might not work. I mean, I'm spending quite a lot of time with the Japanese, and they love robots. To be a rather sort of simplistic model, and George, you'll probably know as much as anybody. But that doesn't necessarily translate to some places. But frankly, there are some things that a robot does better. I would rather be carried up the stairway by a stair lift than a human, if I was sort of thinking about robots broadly. So I think adapting insights that work globally, having a global perspective is important, and then adapting them locally is significant. We just did a session with Stanford on family caregiving and tried to understand the challenges that the startups in the US were facing around family caregiving. And they gave us some really clear perspectives that they're just missing an industry voice around things like, how do we have a common view on impact metrics? What does success look like in family caregiving? How do we better integrate the family caregiving innovators with the health systems, for example, which are often seeing the family as an entirely separate thing outside health and sort of the more formal care, and sort of creating a more sort of an on-ramp between the family system as it is and the health system was one of those sort of loud and clear models. But each location and each locality is going to be different, but there does need to be an ability to tap into global insights and best practices.
And I think one of the key things is obviously making sure that we strongly support evidence-based information and knock back on misinformation, because that's one of the big challenges we face. And I think Mary may be able to comment, but I see it from in the ethnic community that I'm involved with, that misinformation drives a lot of the activity. So therefore, we've got a responsibility to make sure we actually drive evidence-based information.
Look, I agree, and I think there's much we can learn, and we are learning fast now, because we again, the pressure's on. We can't wait. I think the other interesting thing from my perspective, wearing my FECA hat, is and I'm stating the obvious, and everyone else has said it, is access to resources and status, education status, income status is critical. For culturally and linguistically diverse communities, there are particular characteristics. We all have a culture, we all have a language. If you're well educated and have access to resources and money, you can solve problems. What this pandemic and what our situation and what the situation for the silver tsunami is showing, is that the struggle is for those that don't. If you can solve the problem for those that have access to resource issues, then you can solve it for all of us. And I think that's and therein lies the challenge. I mean, what we know now is that in Sydney, the hardest hit population groups are also the poorest, and they're also the ones that are essential workers. So they're also the ones living in two or three intergenerational households. So in many ways, the challenges are clearer and should be clearer, and the way in which we break down how we solve them it relies on us understanding some really complex things that in the past we may have parked. We think we're a first world country. Well, we're not necessarily so in some suburbs. Poverty has got a postcode, and how we apply our thinking to that, I think, is really interesting. So there goes the challenge, networkers.
Yeah, Katie, I mean, your network is quite large. When I imagine that there are a vast array of, access to resources and opportunities within the organizations that you represent. How do you get this sort of equality across there?
So, we make a real effort to reach out to our parts of our network that are in less resourced countries and less resourced organizations. We have so much to learn from them because, to Mary's point, the drive, the need to be innovative, the need to be creative and use sort of basic ingenuity to solve problems when you don't have resources is something we can all learn from and take away from that. I also think Mary made a really good point about the essential workers. At the end of the day, providing services to older adults is a human process. It involves people. And technology does have a role for sure as a lever, as an enabler. But at the end of the day, we need people. And I'd say one of the biggest crises we face right now around the world, particularly in the developed world, is human capital. People willing and able and trained and qualified to provide services to older adults. And every country is fighting for the same small workforce. So we've created a problem for ourselves that we have to solve, which is to make jobs in our field valued and valuable, pay people well, treat them well, develop strong workforce cultures, and give them the tools through technology to allow them to do their jobs efficiently and effectively.
Yeah, I think Katie makes a great point there. I mean, just last week, CEDA released its report about the aged care workforce in Australia, and it talks about a shortage of well over 100,000 in the next couple of years. And to be honest, that's probably underestimating the problem because of the fact that the unmet need is that we have out there. A lot of the stuff we've been looking at within the council is how do you digitally enable a workforce to be able to utilize technology to augment its capabilities. It's all well and good saying we're going to implement an IT system. If the workforce isn't trained about how to use it, doesn't understand the value, the basis of the value around it, the system's poorly implemented, and we've seen that in a lot of system solutions where great solutions are poorly implemented, then you're just going to add work to the industry, not remove work. And we need to make sure we have a workforce which is set up to be able to utilize this technology properly.
I think the other interesting challenge is, of course, decision makers, those that tend to be a bit older, are the least sort of technology migrants, or so that they're non-natural inhabitants of the technology world. So we're making decisions, and we're not anywhere near being experts on it. I mean, so there's a disconnect between knowledge of that at the top. So you see a lot of failed activity, which because it's poorly informed. I think the other bit of challenge is that at the same time, we were absolutely terrified because there's so much investment now in learning about cybersecurity, the number of attacks per day. And it's real because in the sector, the more we use technology, the more likely at some point that we'll be hit.
Absolutely.
And how do you run a human service that relies on getting the right people to the right places to have medication, to do a whole bunch of stuff, when the tablets all crash. So yeah, it's a very real phenomenon. So we solve some problems, and as humans we create others. So there you go.
I think that makes me kind of think, how interested in the other panelists' perspectives. Like, how do we then start to go beyond our remit when we've got things like inequality that are impacting the outcomes? We've got the fact that green environmental climate change is impacting the quality of life for older people. It's like knocking 2 years off the average life expectancy, sort of driven by air pollution. I mean, the cybersecurity piece. It's almost as if we've got a range of skills and a range of agenda items that are mushrooming and are sort of broader than any one industry. And I'm kind of interested in how you all go about like connecting with those cybersecurity, climate change, inequality, institutional breakdown topics, which are impacting our daily work, but they're not necessarily within the industry.
One challenge I've seen is that it makes my board meetings last about 3 hours longer, because as we cover all those topics in our board meetings, we end up going down a whole bunch of rabbit holes. And I guess when you look at Standard 8 within the aged care governance, boards that are skills based is going to be really essential. So you can actually have those discussions at a senior level. I mean, we've seen a lot of boards in aged care which have been volunteer driven with people with all good intentions, but without the lack of skills to be able to capture some of this stuff in their discussions. We need to move to a much more professionalized skills-based boards, so they can actually have those meaningful discussions at a board level rather than just at operational level.
I think it's such a good, interesting point, Stephen, because I feel like issues like climate change and cybersecurity, I'm out of my league, right? I'm on a steep learning curve. And we've always thought those are sort of issues that are very tangential to our core work. But the truth is, they are part of our core work, and we just have to get smarter about it and find those intersections and find those ways of addressing them and kind of tying our work together. We haven't done it yet. We haven't done it yet as a sector. And I think a lot of it is because we just aren't smart enough about it yet.
But at that point, it's incredibly challenging to even get your head around it. I've been diving into crypto in the last few months, and the overlaps with things like care coins and creating models by which you start to give people coins to share their data about their steps and their health issues. It's sort of, you can trace it all back, but you quickly end up with just a crazy amount of budget, and nobody. I think in the 15th century, somebody could know everything.
You haven't met enough Greek women.
That's a fair point, I think. But I would say that the level of skill, just the professionalization, George, your point is, people, by definition, the professionalization is like, I know a lot about my thing, and they burrow deep, and by definition, then they sort of become, they have to be siloed because it's impossible to go deep and broad for everything. And I'd love it to be, hey, we got some awesome tech, cloud answer that gives us answers at, when we need them. I think there may be something that we can kind of get some help from tech, but it's not enough. There does need to be more people who kind of have that perspective, but then the room is so full of different perspectives. You guys know people as more than I do. One way out of this morass, I think, is to have to be quite very specific about the problem. We haven't gone into problems because we could obviously, this could be a 12-hour conversation talking about all the different challenges. The way that Mariana Mazzucato talks about the sort of mission-driven innovation, and I think quite a few people are now sort of taking this model, which is, okay, we don't know everything about everything, but what about falls of people in their homes when they get out of the bath? What about isolation of people whose family have moved away? What about, food nutrition, how to increase the protein consumption? That is, to me, that's interesting. If we can take a slice and then we go deep and then we go very specific and then we identify, okay, who really needs to be at this table with this very specific. And then if it's too broad, we go even deeper and even deeper. And I think there may be a way, if we can just get quite specific, that we can bring enough people together to have those perspectives. I just worry that if we just go up a bit, then it's basically we need Wikipedia, at the table, and it's just sort of too broad. Right? But that's just.
Peak bodies are a challenge, and that in Australia we probably have half a dozen aged care related peak bodies. I mean, LASA and AXA are sort of the big ones, and we've had the guild sort of fold over the last couple of months. But again, we've got OPAM, we've got CODA, we've got so many aged care peak bodies, and they each sort of cover different parts of the sector, so to some degree. So I guess the challenge is how do we have a unified voice? And I mean, I know there's been discussions around that unified voice, but it is hard because again, small market, lots of peak bodies. Big gorilla in the room is government because it pays for 90% of the care type models. So we need to, and they struggle to interact with a lot of peak bodies for various reasons. It's not an easy problem.
And I think that part of the challenge is the way that peak bodies are kind of set up. I mean, you've got a consumer group and a provider group as if they're kind of foes, as if they're not really one of the same. They should be one and the same thing, which I shouldn't. And I feel it a lot because I wear multiple hats. So I could be on something wearing because I'm the chairperson of the federation, but I'm also the employer and provider. And so I feel that schism quite often. And then I wear a tertiary education hat where we talk about workforce, which is the other big elephant in the room, which is because we don't have enough people who want to work in the sector. So I feel that frustration a lot because I can see the perspective. So I don't have to wear one hat all the time. I don't have a job that pays me to talk on behalf of consumers constantly, which you have if you're a CEO of a peak provider. Yeah. And even though you can see the interesting challenge was the conversation we had 2020 and continued into 2021, which was visiting rights in aged care. So when we have lockdowns that we close residential care down, and older people don't get family visits, and that was a massive example of the tension that happens. So so providers had to hold the fort and say, well, we can't have 120 or 240 people walking through here every day. I can't have 2 people walking through my house, but I can have 240 people walking through a facility. Or a residential care home, and yet they were demonized for making those decisions. And in fact, when they had people dying because COVID got inside, then they were demonized again. It dawned on me because I actually went for a walk before it all got really nasty, and a 93-year-old was sitting there, and I said to him, "How are you going?" And he said, "Yeah, really good." He goes, "I don't like this." And he goes, "I've lived through these before." And I said, "Oh, yeah, no, we'll survive." He says, "Absolutely." And I said, "How do you feel about, getting visitors?" And he was just brilliant. He just said, "Look, my 53-year-old son's just separated from his wife. I don't know who he hangs around with. Keep him out of here." he said, "I don't want him hanging around me." And I just thought, great answer. The 53-year-old was writing letters to me saying, "I demand to see my father." And I just ask your father what he wants, and he basically thought, well, actually, I'm quite happy. Leave me alone for a little while. The complex problem. The solution for the individual is already made for them. I mean, he wanted to be safe. He didn't want to have to, risk. He didn't want to take that risk. And no matter what the peak consumer groups are thinking, and no matter what the provider groups are thinking, individuals can make some rational choices, and we need to hear those rational choices somehow and live with the decisions that we make then based on those.
That reminds me of the Atul Gawande's point around the being mortal, I think it is, when he sort of talks about how the younger adult kids are always trying to control and protect, and the older people just want to live their lives, and I think that is a question for us to kind of always ensure that we are the older people of today and tomorrow are different from the older people of yesterday, because people are evolving and constantly changing. And one of the things that I'm interested in, I'm finding myself spending much more time looking at sort of the science of longevity. Not that I'm particularly into all these anti-aging drugs and biotech, but there's some really interesting commonalities with people who are living longer and are healthier, and therefore are very different to the people who were that age, 10 years or 15, 20 years ago. And I think our expectations, just the way that human nature is evolved, is based on what used to work, are the tools and the expectations and the processes that we're applying to tomorrow's problems. And that sort of linear thinking doesn't, I think, work with either the exponential world in which we're living in, which things we just don't think exponentially, or the fact that the type of people who are in aged care buildings or living independently are different than they were 10 or 15 years ago.
I guess the question then is that what responsibility do we have to ensure that the people who are doing things like longevity exercises or the treatments are, again, doing it on the evidence? I mean, I've seen a lot of longevity solutions come out there that are, Peter Evans type stuff, where flash a blue light and stand on one leg and you'll live 5 years longer type stuff, to proper evidence based stuff. I mean, there's strong evidence that things like metformin, if used properly, can increase longevity. What role does technology and industry play in ensuring that we focus on the evidence, not on the hype? And we've all seen the hype, and we've seen the side effects of the hype, so we need to take a responsible role there as well.
Yeah, and in the same way that we need to recognise that while we've added the number of years, humans are living longer. We haven't added enough fun and capability in those later years. Not enough of it. So, and you're right. I mean, if I follow the trajectory of my children's thinking, like my teenagers, I'm losing capability every minute. I know less every day, according to them. So at some point, I'm going to know very little, because they've just decided that I know nothing compared to them. So sort of changing that stereotype. I spoke about it earlier. It's the stereotype of who, what it is to be an older person compared to our younger selves, and how we can capture that and own it and make something of it, is, I think, a really interesting. Our generation, people hopefully listening, and the people here, we're not going to be happy doing things that are not non-fulfilling, which is not. So we have to be responsible for shaping stuff now, because we're not going to want to be hanging around, I don't know, doing boring things. I don't want to be playing bingo at 88. Surely not. So how do we add meaning to those later years? I guess is a bit of a challenge for all of us.
The thing I find so interesting about the whole longevity question is, really, we're extending the years that we're on the planet. It's not just that we're extending old age and the years that we're old. So, it could be that over time we consider, I don't know, young adults start at age 30, not at age 21, because we're all living longer. Middle age goes till 70. And then old age starts. So I think we just have to rethink the whole trajectory of our lifespan, with this idea that we've got perhaps 10 more years of our lifespan. Now, I don't know what that looks like exactly, what the new nomenclature will be. But right now, I think we're very focused on these. We're old for so many more years, so we need to make the best of it, which is true. But we also need to make the best of the rest of our lives.
I think what Chip Conley is good on this, and Joe Coughlin talking about like another 8,000 days that we've got bolted on, and a project we've started with one of our Japanese partners is called Pinkoro, the Pinkoro Society, which is a sort of version of a Japanese phrase meaning to live long and die short. And there is this expectation that if you can actually take a step back and say, what would a good society look like in that perspective, then you would have maximizing your health span, so the time that you are actually alive and in good health as a percentage of your time total alive, the delay of the onset of frailty and chronic morbidity at the end of your life, and then a good and dignified death. And I think a lot of people perhaps don't necessarily think about putting them all together. I think there's a lot of expectations. A colleague of mine was saying that his sort of version of healthy aging that he thinks people are talking about is, I want to stay 40 forever. And I think what we're not necessarily thinking about is actually the whole sweep of things and how to have a quality death as well as a quality life. And I think if we can put that together, and that, I think it changes a few things about how we run society and what expectations are. And it forces the conversation much earlier. And I think that would be really helpful for the whole industry and the whole society to think about aging not just as something that you have to encounter at the end of your life, but something that you really start to work earlier on, as maybe 21, 30, to think through making sure that you maximize your health span. And that work needs to happen much earlier in people's lives.
I mean, one issue that I know that is rising, my kids are a bit older than Mary's, and they're sort of now sort of getting them into the workforce. So how do we ensure that, of course, by increasing our longevity, we just don't, the boomers, and my kids call me a boomer all the time, don't bottle up the system. I mean, there's that challenge of, how do you get out of the way and do something else, which it can be productive, can be enjoyable, can be, fulfilling, but not block career prospects for the younger generation coming through. I mean, we've seen a lot of people who probably should have moved on 10 years ago who are stuck there, and the backlog of 30-year-olds who can't get into their professions because of that is a challenge as well.
It's because we haven't worked out how to create meaning other than employment.
Exactly.
So people hang on to work as if it's meaningful. And to some degree it is, but we have to move beyond that and get none of this is helping, because there's been a huge delay. I was looking at the data the other day, huge delay of people not moving on from what they would have been their last employment years because of COVID. They're basically saying, well, I'll just keep on working because I can't travel. So in the absence, what we substituted work for was travel. And now we're stuck, so we're just hanging. If this goes for 5 years, that's going to be pretty painful.
Such a waste, though. You've got all these problems to solve in the world, and all these older people who have just retired or about to retire or want to retire, who are just incredibly unutilized. And it just feels that, there's been a few people who try to build that bridge, but it just does feel like a massive misallocation of societal resources. And frankly, the older people who've just tried also got the resources as well. And so we've got this big latent, asset in society that we're not putting to use to solve the interesting, it could be community problems or macro problems, but there's a lot of wasted mismatch happening here.
I think that's true. And I think it's because we've never thought of older people as an asset.
Right.
And there's so much sort of ageism in our societies that we don't view them as a resource that we can tap and actually can provide a wisdom and contribution and purpose.
Hey, going back to something that Katie, you and George have both mentioned, and I've seen that you talk about this quite a bit online as well, is the workforce issue and attracting more people into the space. And maybe there's a way here. I'm going to throw out a crazy idea. Katie, you said that we haven't seen older adults as a resource before. Is there a way to partner the resource of older adults and these extra years with the problem of a diminishing workforce?
I absolutely think that there is. And actually, during the pandemic, there's been an interesting example of that. So at the height of the pandemic in New York City, there were something like 70,000 doctors and nurses that came out of retirement.
Wow.
To help provide support to the hospital. In this case, it was mostly hospitals, not so much nursing homes, but in the city. And then that sort of spread around the country. So these are people who had years of a profession. They had lots of skills under their belt, and we needed them. Mm. And I think if we can figure out what was the impetus for those people other than a crisis and what did they get out of it? I think we could try to figure out how do we make this more normal and not just focused in a crisis situation. How do we redesign jobs so that they're much more flexible, part-time, job sharing, whatever it is, and not think of ourselves as the 9 to 5, everything is 9 to 5 and then you go home, so that we can accommodate people's lifestyles as they have left the formal workforce in retirement. So I think we've got a lot to do there, but I think both Stephen and you have suggested it's just there's an untapped resource there.
Definitely. I mean, and one of the roles, obviously, for technology is to remove those demanding drudgery type tasks to enable the individuals to be able to deliver the care type tasks. And again, like you said, there's a whole bunch of people in their 60s and 70s who are much more physically able than what they were 50 years ago, who can play an active role. But if you look at the recruitment in aged care, it's 25-year-olds with a driver's license and the ability to physically lift someone and turn them. That's not the only skill you need. Maybe even the robots will take a role there.
I think the workforce challenges in aged care are so extreme that while we continue to pay them $20+ an hour, we're not going to get older people or younger people wanting to work in the sector. It doesn't. I mean, it's just we need to fundamentally change. So if you talk to any physio student in a university, they'll do anything to not have to go into aged care. They want to do babies. They want to do they'll do disabled. They'll do private practice, but they just don't want to work in aged care.
Even in medicine, I mean, trying to get geriatricians to actually get actively involved. I mean, there's so few of them and so scarcely funded that. It's at the end of the day, money has an important role.
Yeah, there's a program in the U.S. called Teach for America, and I just think this is an amazing model. So they take kids out of college, make it highly competitive to get in, make it very prestigious to get an assignment teaching at an inner city school for 2 years. And these students make this commitment. And it's an incredible resume builder. It's an incredible opportunity for these kids to learn real life skills, because this is hard work. Some of them stay in teaching, some of them don't. But somehow Teach for America has made this a prestigious step out of college. And I keep thinking, what's the magic there that we can translate into our field and create that kind of prestigious opportunity, and hope that, of the thousands of kids that end up in whatever this thing becomes, half of them will decide to make it a career, or a third of them. But I haven't sort of figured out what the magic is, but there is some magic there.
Well, I think a lot of the time, advertising companies change systems. I mean, I was reading about how in the past, women in the 1920s didn't smoke, and this was a real problem for Philip Morris, and so they created this Torches of Freedom campaign where women were going down the street smoking, and this is liberating. And guess what? After that time, we had a massive increase in percentage of women smoking, and I think there is an opportunity for proper propaganda for good, if you like, where we could get smart, get creative, and sort of think about how to, as you say, Katie, change the perception of care. Could it be as exciting as going off and doing a year of service abroad to go up, help build schools in Nepal? Could we have that same kind of mentality? But I think that's a really interesting opportunity for the people outside aging who are working in Madison Avenue to think about using some of their skills, or the Google entrepreneurs who are optimizing AdWord clicks, and social media companies who are wanting us to get addicted. Let's get them to get addicted to the good things.
So obviously one key area we've been looking at is, so if we have this workforce challenge, how do you improve the productivity of the workforce? How do you make them be able to do more within the limited resources? And, we've been looking at what is the role of data. If you have data transparency, can you enable a workforce to focus on the things that have effect rather than focus on the things that don't have effect? I mean, in healthcare, we used to talk about 30% of what we spent in healthcare was wasted. Until you actually have transparency, you don't know where that waste is. Do we have that same opportunity in aged care? Do we sort of start looking at what parts of what's being delivered by an aged care provider at $40 an hour, whatever it is, can be replaced? And I think Katie touched on it and Stephen touched on it, by community. How do you get community to fill in some of those gaps so that aged care providers provide high value care, not just low value care. And we talk about value-based healthcare in the acute care sector. We haven't even started to have that discussion about value-based aged care. How do we value the care we're providing, and put the resources in where it's going to have the maximum bang for buck. It's data's a tool there, but again, having the people at the ground actively involved, because if Canberra defines what data is, what value is, then they have different metrics to what an 85-year-old living at home with multiple disabilities has.
Hey, Mary, I wanted to ask here, because your work with FECA, you're representing ethnic communities, and a lot of the aged care employees that I interact with in my work are from ethnic communities. A lot of them are migrant workers, or their families have, come over themselves. Is this a sustainable sort of resource? Are people only engaging in aged care because of the low wage and low barter entry there for them? What's the story?
Oh, the story is really complex, of course. So the workforce has got a really high number of people from migrant refugee backgrounds. A lot of them are visa holders, so they're on a pathway perhaps to permanent residency, but not always. It's a very difficult space to get young kids, our kids, to work in. So we've got low uptake of that, and we've got international borders closed at the moment. So we're having to keep the workforce that we have and entice them to stay in an environment where they themselves are being underpaid, and job satisfaction is not always great. So workforce is a really tricky thing for us. On top of that, we've got mandatory vaccinations now for people working in residential care. So it's the first sector that's got that happening. So they having to jump through another hoop. So we need to focus on this, because we're just not going to have the supply that we had from overseas, inevitably coming through to us in the short to maybe medium term. So it's a massive issue. Those of it, the clever employers are providing really good work conditions and trying to understand how important it is to keep that workforce, and also to sustain a more permanent relationship with our workers, where we decasualize. We take them off the kind of we are in control and we'll give you the hours we want, to the you tell us what you want and where you want to work, so that we can create a more permanent and enjoyable place for you to work, where you can connect to individuals and your work has meaning, as well as just paying the bills. So look, I think it's a very complex question. I mean, I don't know how many people in first world countries raise children in the hope that they work in aged care. How many of us are telling our kids that your best bet is to go and become a carer in an aged care facility, or in fact in someone's home. So it's a real challenge. So I don't have any. I mean, look, we've got a workforce, and we're not losing. Our turnover is low. So on the positive, obviously, people that choose to work in that space stay if you give them good reason to, and they enjoy their work. So we don't. Once you start working in aged care, I think you start to enjoy it. But there are some challenges.
Well, yeah, I mean, a level 4 home care patient, 20 years ago would have been in an acute care hospital, and now they're really providing that sort of level of care in the home, and it's not easy. I mean, it's quite a risky challenge to manage that.
One of the big things we push for, wearing multiple hats, is that the Commonwealth Government consider converting a whole bunch of visa holders into, giving them permanent residency during the pandemic, because they couldn't go home. And keeping them and saying, well, you can be eligible for permanent residency, stay here, and the only obligation we have on you is, of course, to be an upright citizen and to continue working in the sector that you're currently working in. So I think that would have been a win-win, but it's so in between everything else. We're also caught up in immigration and border challenges, which don't always make for logical policy decisions. So
then we're into politics, right?
Well, that's exactly right, and it is going to be really interesting what immigration policies look like post-COVID. So yeah, I think even for groups like us, the dialogue, the conversation is going to have to be different, because people are frightened of others now in a way that is even more extreme than before. So it's going to be really hard to have, let's do a global economy, a global population movement approach to problem solving. That conversation's a long way from our thinking in any logical sense. I don't think anyone would be brave enough to have it right now.
Yeah. I mean, it's classic. I mean, we have done that pendulum thing. We've gone from, strong institutionalized care with large residential aged care facilities, and then now we've moved over and started saying, okay, all care has to be in the home. And like you said, Mary, I mean, somewhere in the middle there, pan metronaristos, the Greeks say, somewhere in the middle, there's a middle ground that makes sense. So we need to find that middle ground.
I think the Royal Commission pointed to some of those challenges, and hopefully the move to IPA, Independent Hospital Pricing Authority, looking at values in the way that it does in hospital and acute care may help. I think the other challenge is this move to home care and what that means, because what we've found is that home care is staying at home. I mean, who doesn't want to be staying? Who doesn't want to live in their own home? Whatever that looks like. But it's been a very, very tricky thing to do, because it's not always ideal.
Well, and I think part of that is to look at what are the intergenerational opportunities and stop segregating older people in their own separate environments. I mean, it's just not natural, right?
And we idolize it. I mean, we overcorrect. So that yes, institutions are poor and not places that we need to say, why don't we improve congregate living or joint up living or situations? Because I mean, what we're finding is, because women are living longer, is a social isolation of older people in their own homes. I mean, there is no joy being in your own home, bricks and mortar, when you see nobody except for the carer. So at least in a, I mean, why can't we design places that bring people together and aren't institutions, rather than the solution being to lock them in their home and say, you should be happy here. Someone will rock up between 8 o'clock and 9 o'clock, and the rest of the day, have fun. So when they're really frail, I'm not talking about, so, and with dementia. So that, look, we need to be cleverer. And that sort of dichotomy, this or that, has got to stop. And we've got to think, well, how do you actually do middle ground stuff a bit better, which takes the best of this and the best of that and puts it together into something that looks like fun.
And a lot of that is that I think good work is already taking place with age-friendly cities, with a World Health Organization program. And I think there's opportunities to say, what does that next version look like if we design our villages and our towns and cities that are genuinely intergenerational, genuinely inclusive, and the ability for older people to be seen and be central in the life of a local village and a local town, that may require some retooling. It may require not having a car-centric approach to building towns like most US cities are still, and it might have a new approach to security and safety and their sort of urban planning and urban design and social infrastructure becomes part of the conversation.
It's really interesting that we're mentioning those intergenerational communities. I'm edging towards the point of buying my first home, and I keep saying like, oh, retirement village for wait, no, they wouldn't let me in. But the idea of being able to live in a community of people who are up for socially engaging, who want extra support, who want to provide value to me as a younger person is really exciting. And it's kind of disappointing that there's nothing there immediately for me to jump at. I think there are some models in the US, maybe Katie or Stephen, you know of some that are kind of edging in that direction?
Yeah, there are some.
There are in Greece. Sorry, I was just going to say that the villages in Greece do it really well.
I was going to say that my parents' old village in Greece would be a perfect environment for that. I just can't get over there at the moment.
Yeah. Give me the plane ticket and I'll go.
And they happen organically.
Yeah.
Sorry, Katie.
No, I was just going to say there are some examples. I think there are more and more people who are providers that are looking to create those examples. There's some of them that are sort of natural, that have just organically evolved. I mean, I live in a neighborhood in Washington, D.C., close to the Capitol, so Capitol Hill. And there is a village, a virtual village in my neighborhood of older adults who have come together and said, we want to stay in this neighborhood for as long as we can. So we're going to come together. We're going to create our own organization. We're going to run it ourselves. We're going to provide companionship to each other. We're going to help each other out. We're going to provide activities. So if there's a group of guys that love history and they meet for lunch every Tuesday and talk about history, and there's another group that plays yoga. I joined when I moved to this community because I was so curious about what was going on. I can't, I'm busy. I don't do anything with them, but except read their newsletter and know what they're doing. But I love it because it's completely organic. It's completely self-driven. And it's older people saying, this is how we want to live the rest of our lives, or as long as we possibly can, to live our best lives. And we know we need each other. So we're going to lean on each other and learn from each other. And there are these all over the country.
And this is an opportunity for technology to play a role in facilitating that, because again, the chances of walking down the street and bumping into a half a dozen people with that same mindset is limited, but finding a half a dozen people online with that same mindset within 10 kilometers is probably a much more positive use of Facebook than watching anti-vaxxers online. So
I think you're right.
There's opportunities there.
I love how a lot of these conversations end up with localism being a common thread, which is, at the end of the day, it kind of goes back to how we've lived most of society in small groups of, 150 people, intergenerational, very organic. And I think a lot of what Europe has got to add to the conversation around innovation is to reimagine what success looks like, where I think a lot of the time we think that innovation is all defined in terms of tech startups and big corporations. But I think a lot of the more organic village vibe is native to Europe. And I think there's parts of America that are doing this as well. But I think the mentality in still American cities is not like this. And I think that's where going back to the very beginning of the conversation, learning from Japan, learning from parts of Asia, learning from parts of Australia, and learning from wherever they are in the world that are doing interesting things. The Blue Zones, for example, I think has done a fantastic job of just sort of highlighting what works in a very organic, but also analytically helpful way to sort of pull apart a model and bring those components. So that to me it just sort of shows that we sometimes have to go back to go forward.
Yeah. Hey guys, we've covered a lot of different stuff here, lots of different opinions and ideas shared on a really huge range of topics. Before I start wrapping up, do you guys have any questions for each other or anything you wanted to bring up while we've got this space and time?
Well, you mentioned, George, about the efficiency. I think it's very interesting. I don't know if there's resources you can share about what are you doing in terms of helping people be more efficient in terms of the processes and the procedures. Is that a study that you've done?
So we've been looking at, we did a study last year looking at sort of the current level of use of technology in aged care and found it to be hugely heterogeneous. We have some organizations that had great systems, bulk of organizations that had a few systems in place, but not well integrated, and many organizations that had nothing. So we've been looking at that whole model of digital maturity. How do you build on your digital maturity to improve your organization? And the reality is, if your core infrastructure doesn't work, then just dropping in a solution into a organization without core infrastructure. I often talk about this concept of vanity projects. People do these great technology demonstration projects, which look really good, but don't actually have any value because they just solve a very small part of the problem. So building on digital maturity is really important. That then reflects back on digital workforce. How do you enable the workforce, and how do you provide resources for the workforce to be to take better use of technology? But then co-design comes into it. How do you then work with the industry to say, what are the solutions we need? Because, I worked in vendor land for many years, for a large American multinational, and, producing a solution is easy. Producing a technology solution is easy. Implementing it in an effective way in an organization and doing the change management associated with it is the hard part. And, it's going to be an ongoing journey. But again, highlighting successes and sharing failures, I think, is a really important part of the journey forward, so that we learn from each other and build upon it.
Yeah, maybe follow up, because we're doing a project right now where one of the objectives is how do we shift from one person able to take care of 2 people to one person take care of 4 people, so like doubling the efficiency in the workforce. But I think there's part of that is also what's the quality of the experience as you get. You don't just want to reduce numbers, you want to reduce numbers, save costs, and improve the quality. And I think that sort of technology is a component, but the overall.
This is where co-design is really important, including the consumer. You're making sure that we actually have that consumer reported experience and outcome as part of the measures, not just, we can now provide care at $3 per person versus $6 a person. That's not the metric you want, but realistically, if we're only going to get X amount of dollars, we have to work out how do we utilize that X amount of dollars most effectively. So it's a double-edged sword, but the experience is critical as well.
Well, George Margelis, Mary Patetsos, Katie Smith Sloan, and Stephen Johnston, thank you so much for your time today. It's been really enjoyable. I feel like I've been scrambling to keep up and stay on top of everything we've been talking about. So it's been really informative and interesting for me as well. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks a lot, Ash.
Well, we hope you enjoyed this episode of the Aged Care Enrichment Podcast, brought to you by Silver Adventures. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening. And if you're enjoying it, please leave us a review. We'd really appreciate it. If you're interested in finding out how immersive virtual reality experiences can enrich the lives of older adults, visit the Silver Adventures website today at www.silver, that's SILVR, adventures.com.au. See you next week.